comes Mr. Dr. Brown.
Hello, thank you for coming today. Again, a lot of announcements today. Appreciate all your patience, appreciate you being here. Got a lot of the Baker family here. This man right here, Ted Zucker, he was smart enough to marry a Baker. So he's smart enough to marry one. He's probably smart enough to give us a talk. I want to have a brief moment of silence. This picture next to me is a picture of a B-17 that was here 2 different times since 2019. He said a tragic thing happened down in Texas. 5 of the crewmen from the plane that was here died, and you see a picture of some of the crew there aboard the plane. I want us to just bow our heads for those people. Also Alan Sanderson, we lost him 11 months ago. Bert Ramsey Baker, she worked on she's the mother-in-law of Ted Zucker and Bernadette's mother. She died 7 months ago. She worked on the P-47. She was a Rosie the Riveter. She came up from Kentucky. Major General Eric Schwinker died about 6 months ago. James Roach, who used to sit over here, he died a couple months ago, and he was on the LST on his tour recently. And there's some others that I haven't mentioned, but maybe just a moment of silence for all these people. Thank you. They've already announced a lot of things that's been announced, so you don't have to listen to me very long. We got a fly-in. That's where a lot of private pilots are going to park their plane behind here on December 10th in the morning. We're going to have breakfast. If you'd like to come, you can talk to some pilots, see some unique planes. On 12/15, that's the middle of December, James Watson, who usually sits over here, is going to talk about, he was on LST 208 in the Philippines, and he got hit by a kamikaze. He's 97 years of age. He will talk about that event. He was also in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is the biggest naval battle ever in our history. On 1-5, Claude Wirtz, you heard of Wirtz Lumber Company. He's going to come talk about his experiences in the 30s and 40s in Evansville during the wartime. In April, hopefully we're going to have the Ritual of the Unknown Soldier. We did it last year, and there's a mimic behind our World War I car. But hopefully we get Mike Gable's son. Mike Gable's son is now retired from the military. He was all city, all state, all everything in football here, but he was also a Ranger. And he was one of the 650 or so that became a guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That's a rare, a very rare honor to be that. We found a person in Henderson recently, it's 100 years old. He's the only Marine that's ever been a guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And hope he will talk with Mike Gable's son. I think Mike Gable's son is Zach, and I wouldn't probably mess with him. He could probably beat all of you up. And I haven't got a promise from Mr. Zach yet, so don't tell anybody, please. Before I introduce our guest speaker, there's a couple of new things. There's a motorcycle over there. There's only, you've already said that, there's only 5 left in the world. It's a German motorcycle. We were given it recently for a loan. There are only 46 made in the world. The new community gallery talked about it. On the floor of the community gallery, there's a railroad map of all of the United States. It's put down by Donna Bowen and Rich Hawkinsmith. But just think of how important the railroad. When Ted comes up here and talks, he's going to talk a little bit about Moscow. And December 5th of 41, Moscow was about taken over, and then Hitler, in some of his good sense, didn't go after Moscow. But if they would have taken over Moscow, most of their trains went through there. And so if the trains would have not worked for the Russians, it would have been a very devastating event at that time. They talked about the uniforms, but I want these people in red shirts. I want Mr. Bruce Green to come up here front and center, Mike Lynn front and center, right up on the stage. Mr. Mike Tiemann front and center. Mike Tiemann, please. Donna Bowen, Rich Hawkinsmith front and center. Up on the stage, please. If you can find them out there in the lounge or in the bathroom, bring them out. And we got 3 new bathrooms back here. Mr. James, on the stage, please. Mr. James hitched one bathroom, so if women want a bathroom, the seats are heated. It's right out. There are 3 outhouses out here, and they're very warm seats. I'm sure you'd really like that. Now, I only have 3 out of the 6 people who are supposed to be up there, but number 1, this is Bruce Green. He's already given the talk on Auschwitz, and Forrest, I want you up here, please. He's giving a talk on Auschwitz. He's going to be in charge of our volunteers. So if you want to, if any of you have a red shirt at home, you're halfway there. You're halfway there, then you can come and do. We've got 6 different types of categories that you can volunteer here. He's in charge of volunteers, and he can talk to you about what things you could do here. We'd love to have any of you here help with things. This next man is Mike Lynn. Bruce was a teacher for a bunch of years over in the Rockport area, and Mike Lynn worked at Alcoa for many years, but he's in charge of our archives and our displays along with some other people. But if you're interested in archiving or doing some displays, we have 8,600 items here in our archives, and it's a continual process. So anybody want to work with him, he's excellent. He's a little nicer than I am. This next guy here is John Gross here. If he's here, in front and center, please. This is Mike Tiemann. He's in charge of that gift shop over there, and also in charge of memberships. So we'd like you to become a member. We'd also like you to donate things. If you've got something in your garage or your attic that would be worthwhile for historical purposes here. Next guy is Forrest Gottman. He's been here 9 months. He already talked to you briefly. And Forrest has been our executive director for the last 9 months. He's got another job here in the near future, but he has put us into the stratosphere. He's a very good in a little bit of everything, and he's put us in the technology world. I'm sure your grandkids and other kids and other people have told you how to do things. Well, he makes me feel real good about how much my technical skills are all the time. But he's done a great job for us, and you probably won't see him unless he comes out here as a visitor status. He's got a wife and a young 9-month-old son beside us. He's real proud. Okay, these, I want you to have a visual of that. Go get one of them and grab them if you want to do anything with them. Love to have you do that. Okay, thank you. Okay. The last thing is you are all of you need some birthday presents and some Christmas presents, some Hanukkah presents, some New Year's presents. So I'm going to give you a strong recommendation. You tell your grandkids, your nieces, your nephews, your kids, I want a present. And here's what your present should be. You can be your mantra. I want you to take me to this museum out here. The reason I say that is they will hear something from you that you will talk about your parents, aunts, and uncles, of what they experienced in World War II. They'll bring up all kinds of things. Theories of education say parents, relatives teach as much as teachers. Now, you didn't hear me say that, teachers, but we want you to just say that's what I want. They can't buy anything. You don't need anything. They want, just bring them out here and say, that's all I want is you to come with me, grandkid or kid or somebody. And also, if you got any items, we really need them for the archives, because we're trying to preserve them. So that's enough of everything. I want to introduce this young man here, Ted Zucker. I met him in April of 2022. He's a husband of Bernadette Baker, and we've got some Baker kids here. We've got several Baker kids here. Stand up front and center, please. Okay, these are Baker kids. Okay, have you ever heard of John Russell Baker? He's an architect here from 46 to about 82. He's an architect, made Holy Trinity Church and a bunch of other things in Anderson, Evansville. He also then owned the Tennessean with their mama, and the Tennessean had it for 14 years, from 82 to 96 or so, and they were some of the best cooks in the world. Those hamburgers were pretty thin, but they were still good. The Baker, I already talked about, their mother Bert worked on that plane, but we're really lucky to have him. In the front row over here is a guy named Harold Pettis. He's from Slaughters, Kentucky, only about 8 miles away from where Bert was born. And he came up here, and he was big in World War II, and got back and was a good friend of Bert's, and they grew up only 8 to 10 miles away down Kentucky, and she worked on the P-47. Both of them also worked at the Bucyrus area plant. So, Mr. Zucker here is very much a historian, drove all the way from Louisville to come talk to us. We're lucky to have him, and he's very much a historian on a person you'll hear about. He owns BZ Consultants, and I think his wife does more work than he does with the consulting firm. So that's another smart man, gets the women to do all the work. And if you get done right, the women usually do it. So he is pretty smart. Come on up here, Ted.
Well, after that introduction and your kind applause, I guess I better produce today, deliver the goods, so. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be here, and I am thrilled to see so many people here today. That's great. I have always been passionate about history, even as young as I can remember, as far back as I can remember. In particular, military history, and in particular, World War II. Years ago, before I retired, I was teaching some adult education classes. One of them was a film class. That's another passion of mine. Movies. I'm a geek, and I admit it. The other was a World War II history class, which I called What If They Had Won? And what we did is we would look at certain battles, campaigns. I would talk about what unfolded, what really happened, history as we know it today. And then we would speculate, well, what if things had gone differently? What would the ramifications be? How would that affect the outcome of the war itself? Quite an interesting, all speculation, of course, but very interesting. But one of the things that became clear during that class, what was the best secret weapon the Allies had? The answer? Adolf Hitler. The man made some bad choices, made mistakes, made some decisions that would eventually undo the Third Reich and bring about his doom and the destruction of Nazi Germany. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Would you like to hear about a few of them? All right then. Just a quick synopsis. Germany invaded Poland September 1939. Now there are people that will say, well, right there was his biggest mistake, starting a war that eventually would go against him. He didn't see it that way at the time. But within a month, they had crushed the Polish army by using a tactic that became known as blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks supported by air power smashing through the Polish army, which, while it looked strong on paper, was actually outmoded, outdated. Horse-mounted lancers, planes that looked like a Piper Cub that somebody would have over here on the field. The equipment they had just wasn't able to stand up against the better German planes, tanks, and so forth. Now, after Poland fell, there was a 6-month period, became known as the phony war, because the German ground forces weren't doing anything else. There was fighting on the high seas, German U-boats and surface raiders out hunting British ships and stuff. But the land war came to a stop for a while. So it went from blitzkrieg to sitzkrieg. But the British knew that the Germans were bound to start again. So what they did was they established the BEF, British Expeditionary Force. hundreds of thousands of troops, plus tanks, artillery, and all the support units and equipment, and they sent it to France. Also, the Royal Air Force took planes and put them on fields in France, all waiting for when the attack would come. The French had built a series of forts and fortifications known as the Maginot Line. I imagine most of you have heard of that. Incredible complex, underground, really in-depth defenses. And they were convinced that the Germans would not be able to break through when they attacked. French and British troops were inside, garrisoning the Maginot Line. And it ran all the way from the Swiss border up to Belgium, hundreds of miles. Well, time passed, and eventually in April, the Germans started their next move. They went into Denmark, capitulated in about 4 hours, and from Denmark, they started transferring troops to Norway. The invasion of Norway was on. That lasted for a month or two. Norwegians put up a very good defense. As a matter of fact, the German Navy suffered some really big losses during that campaign. And the French and British actually sent troops to help them defend Norway. But the German ground forces prevailed and Norway fell. So now it is early May, and the Germans are making their move into France. British and the French still insisted that the Germans, no German will pass through the Maginot Line. Well, they're right. They didn't pass through. They went around. They flanked them by invading neutral Belgium and then the Netherlands. And those countries fell pretty quick. And their blitzkrieg tactics into France, and the French and the British caught off guard, were not able to stop them. They delayed them, they fought, but they were being pushed back. It became obvious that the British were going to have to pull the WWII out of France, or they would lose everybody, all of it. So they were given orders to head for the coastal city of Dunkirk. And from there, they were going to be evacuated back to England. And that was a job. The German army surrounded Dunkirk. The British had a defensive line there. How long could they hold? They weren't sure. If they had been able to take Dunkirk, then they would have scooped up almost 400,000 Allied soldiers, British, some French, some Belgian. But something happened. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, head of the German Air Force, and an old beer buddy of Adolf Hitler, went to his buddy and said, "My Fuhrer, let my boys take Dunkirk. I will go in, they will go in and bomb and strafe, and they will break their defensive spirit and make them surrender. Hold the army in place, don't let them continue in. I promise you, I will break Dunkirk." Hitler said, "Okay, go right ahead." And they bombed, and they strafed, and they strafed, and they bombed. They sank ships that were coming in to ferry troops off. They did a lot of damage, but they did not break the Dunkirk defenses. They did not waver in their resolve. As a matter of fact, they pulled off a miracle. A lot of small, privately owned craft, pleasure boats, the type of thing you go out on a weekend and do some fishing, were commandeered, and they were going to be used to help bring troops home. When the civilian owners found out that they were being used to bring the boys back, almost all of them volunteered to operate the boats themselves. And they came over in large numbers, a boat that holds 6 men, or 10 men, or 20 men, whatever. They made several trips back and forth. Artillery fire and planes, the German planes, constantly attacking. A lot of ships were lost. A lot of lives were lost. But by the time the operation was over, 338,000 troops had been saved, brought back to England. 338,000. That's the core by which the British built a brand new army, reorganized, that eventually would come back and fight again. North Africa, Italy, Normandy, all of that. Hitler could have, if he had let the ground forces do their job, scooped all of those men up, and they would not be there to fight later. Big mistake. Now, at the time, that didn't necessarily look like that would be too big of a problem, but what happens is over time, all these mistakes would accumulate. So what was the next one? Well, the Battle of France is over. Now the Battle of Britain begins. The Germans had a plan, Operation Ceylon, to invade the British Isles. Hitler really didn't think it would be necessary. He was convinced the British would see the light and would, negotiate a peace. Well, he didn't count on Winston Churchill, who was the right man, in the right place, at the right time, and he said, we will fight, and we are not going to give up. And they didn't. The English have a characteristic. They're able to persevere during adversity, and they certainly showed that during the Battle of Britain and what followed up after that. So the plan was troops loaded on river barges ferried across the channel and attack at key points. But it was vital, absolutely vital, that first the German Air Force get air supremacy over the channel, because the British Navy and the RAF could do a lot of damage to any troop carriers coming across the channel. And river barges, not exactly the best for going on an ocean. And there weren't enough of them to carry everybody in one trip. So it would have been quite an operation. And remember, they lost a lot of ships during the Norwegian campaign. Fewer ships to protect them. So it was absolutely vital that they first get air supremacy. First week was what we call the Channel fight. And this is where the pilots of fighters, German fighters, would simply fly out over the channel and, like knights of old, jousting with their opponent, fighter against fighter. Nothing really, happened as far as fighting the battle. It was just their first getting a feel for what they were up against. The Germans had more veteran combat pilots than the British did. Then came the second phase, which was when they started bombing shipping, port facilities, industrial centers, but they were ordered not to bomb civilian population centers. And that was what would lead to the next mistake. When they decided that they were losing too many planes during daylight raids, they switched to nighttime raids. A lot harder to hit a bomber at night because none of the planes had radar. You can't go flying up in the dark. You're going to run into somebody, So mostly it was anti-aircraft, and sometimes you hit a plane, sometimes you don't. So they went entirely to nighttime bombing. Well, one night, a group of bombers got lost, couldn't find their intended target, didn't know where they were. So the commander ordered them to abort the mission, turn back, and head back home. Well, it's not a good idea to land when you still have a full load of bombs. So the standard procedure, jettison the bombs. And they did, and then they headed back. Well, they were over London. So London got hit by bombs. And that made the British say, okay, the gloves come off. And they were going to get back at the Germans for that. The commander of the German plane and his exec were ordered to Berlin because you broke the rules and there will be consequences. Well, the very night that they got to Berlin, the British dropped bombs on Berlin. And here's Hermann Göring, who once said, guaranteeing no bombs will ever fall on Berlin. Göring had a habit of writing checks that he couldn't cash throughout the war. He made promises and he couldn't deliver. This was another. This enraged Hitler. And in a fiery speech to the people, he swore, he vowed that for every bomb the British drop on us, we will drop 100 or 1,000. And so he ordered the German bombers to start bombing London and other civilian population centers. Now, prior to that, they had been hitting the RAF fields, really causing so much chaos and destruction that the Royal Air Force was close to collapse. I'm serious, they were that desperate. But now with them switching to civilian targets, that gave the Royal Air Force a chance to reorganize, get the pilots they needed, get the planes together, and start meeting these bombers as they came in. British had a great system, radar, directional control centers, and they would have flights from particular fields go up and intercept the bombers coming from here, and another group, the bombers coming from there, etc., etc. The Germans started losing lots of planes, lots of pilots, crews. Casualties were heavy. As a matter of fact, just to let you know, by the time that the Battle of Britain came to an end, when the Germans realized they weren't going to get air supremacy, Hitler decided to postpone the invasion, and eventually they abandoned the idea altogether, so it never happened. Out of 2,365 pilots flying for the Allies, and that included British, Australian, New Zealand, Rhodesian, Canadians, all of them, 446 were lost. 446 out of well over 2,000. German losses, 1,644 killed, and another 1,445 either captured or listed as missing in action, over 3,000 casualties. Germans took it real hard, a big hit, but they left England intact. They were unable to neutralize or bring Britain out of the war. Think about that. If Britain had negotiated peace or surrendered or been invaded and beaten, we wouldn't have had any place to launch our attack on D-Day. Where would we have staged from? Iceland? I don't think so. No facilities, not enough room for all the stuff that we would have needed. It would have been difficult, if not impossible, to launch an invasion of German-held Europe if England was out of the war. So, even before the Battle of Britain was over, Hitler lost interest and was thinking of the one thing that he was really wanting to get done, and that was the invasion of Russia. He hated the Russians. The Russians didn't like the Germans, but they had made a pact prior to the outbreak of war, in which they said, okay, we'll leave each other alone. You do your thing, we'll do our thing. Matter of fact, Russia invaded Poland from the other side. The same time the Germans were invading Poland. Stalin, leader of Russia, was as bad or worse a leader, dictator, than even Adolf Hitler. He killed millions of his own people during the purges of the 30s. So he was never a good guy. Now, Hitler was thinking about in Russia, and he says, I want to invade in the spring of 1941. But William Canaris, Admiral Raeder, and two naval officers, Canaris was the counterintelligence chief, and Raeder was the actual supreme commander of the German Navy. Raeder went to him and said, my friend, I know that you want to go to Russia because we need their oil, but I have an idea that would save us the need to invade Russia and would get us all the oil we need, and that would be through North Africa. Britain had Egypt, but Britain was very weak in Egypt at this time, 36,000 troops at the most. The Suez Canal, a vital part of the British transportation and supply route to the Middle East, because now the Mediterranean was becoming too dangerous. Italy had submarines and navy, the Germans were putting submarines and planes. Any ships getting to Alexandria, Egypt would be under constant attack. But Hitler also thought it would be a good idea to capture Gibraltar, which is at the tip of Spain. They controlled the Straits of Gibraltar. So how would he do it? Well, you'd have to march troops through Spain all the way down to attack Gibraltar. But Spain was remaining neutral. Spain was a pro-German, pro-fascist country. But its leader, Francisco Franco, had just finished a long, bloody, nasty civil war and gained control of Spain. He did not want to get back into another war. So he hemmed and hawed and said, let me think about that. You know, if we give up neutrality, we could become targets for the British and their allies. Well, Hitler tried to put pressure on him, and he just refused. And Hitler came back from a meeting and referred to Franco as that Jesuit swine. He just wouldn't go along with it. Well, Raeder was telling him the way to do it is to attack Egypt when they're weak. They have to go 12,000 miles around the tip of Africa and come up through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal to get supplies to Alexandria and Cairo. That takes a long time. And right now, because they're fearing an invasion, this was still during the latter part of the Battle of Britain, they couldn't spare as many troops because they figured they would need them for defending the islands. The time to strike was now. Their Axis allies, the Italians, were in Libya. If the Libyans would sortie out and attack, and if they could break through, great. But if they couldn't, the Germans should send forces to help. And this is what Raeder was telling him. So Hitler sent a general down there to take a look at the situation, because apparently the Italians started out, but they didn't go all the way to hit the British. They stopped and then weren't moving. They weren't doing anything. So he sent a man down there to look over the situation and report back. And he came back and said, we should send 4 armored divisions. That will do it. That will give the Italians and our troops enough strength to break through and take Egypt. And if you take Egypt, you get the Suez Canal. And if you get the Suez Canal, right beyond that is the Middle East, very lightly garrisoned, and you'd be swimming in all the oil you need. You wouldn't have to go into Russia. And even if you did, where are the Russian oil fields? They're in the southern part, near the Middle Eastern countries. If you invade Europe, or from Europe, like they actually did, you'd have to go about 2,000 miles to get down to the Caucasus region where the oil was. Didn't make sense. Well, Hitler, he hemmed and hawed. He didn't make any decision. He thought about it. But he was also thinking that, oh, well, we should occupy the Azore Islands. Now, the Azores and the Canaries are all out near Africa or off Portugal, Spain. And his commander said, well, why would we do that? Well, they'd be good bases to use to launch our attacks against Gibraltar or Britain or the convoys. And his officer, his Navy officer said, they're too far away to interfere with the convoys up north. And he says, we could take them, but we'd have a double of the time keeping them resupplied. It just wasn't worth it. It wasn't feasible. It wasn't practical. Well, he was insistent. He kept saying, let's, think about this. And this caused time to go by. And as time went by, the British were slowly getting stronger in Egypt by getting reinforcements in. And eventually, they went on the offensive and were able to push the Italians back. So Hitler finally said, okay, we'll send one division. I got 22 Panther divisions, but I want to hold them for the Russian invasion. Well, the officer that did the visit down to North Africa said, one is not enough. You might as well just forget the whole idea. One division won't be enough. He had a chance to do a desert storm, and he waited too long, and by the time he started to come around to the idea, it was too late. So he missed an opportunity that would have saved him the grief of going into Russia. However, you got to remember, I think the real reason he wanted to invade Russia was ideological rather than just to get their oil. They needed oil, but they could have gotten it in the Middle East a lot easier. But he missed an opportunity. Bad idea. Now, finally, after securing France and securing, Netherlands and all of that, he was ready to turn to Russia. Operation Barbarossa. And he wanted to do it in the spring of '41. But a couple of things got in the way. The Italians invaded Greece, and the Greeks kicked them out and kicked them all the way back to Albania, where they came from. And so they didn't call the Germans for help. It was obvious that they needed help, but Mussolini didn't want to admit it. So Hitler says, all right, send some troops, we'll help them take Greece. So they had that battle going on. In the meantime, he had a position in Yugoslavia that the government would become pro-German. Prince Paul, the regent of Yugoslavia, made a pact with the Nazis. Well, patriots said, no, we're not going to allow that. They overthrew that government and repudiated the deal that they had made with Nazi Germany. That really made Hitler mad, and he says, all right, invade Yugoslavia. And they sent in a number of divisions. Yugoslavians didn't answer the call, except the Serbians did, but the Slovenians and the Croats, they just stayed home. They weren't going to fight. So the army itself eventually beaten. But what was interesting and unique in Yugoslavia is that they had a partisan army, and it was a standing partisan army. They fought and held down German divisions throughout the rest of the war. Divisions that the Germans could have used in Russia, but they were stuck in Yugoslavia because the partisans were very active. So now he has to delay his attack, and it wasn't until the summer of '42, yes, the summer, and he went in, again, the Blitzkrieg, Stalin made the mistake of putting all of his defenses along the frontier border. Well, this made it easier for the Germans when they broke through to swing around, encircle a group, and catch them in what became known as cauldron battles. And that's when they had them surrounded. They couldn't escape. They either fought to the death, or they would surrender, or they would be annihilated. And that's what happened. A lot of Russian soldiers surrendered. They weren't exactly, and as we may see today on what's going on in the Ukraine, they weren't exactly inspired to fight for a regime that was so totalitarian. Germany put three-pronged attack into Russia. Northern group going for Leningrad, central group going for Moscow, and the southern group going toward the Ukraine and Belarus, where the foodstuffs and industry was, with the focus on Stalingrad, because that was the jumping off to go to the Caucasus, where the oil fields were. Well, they were so far apart, they could not support each other. They underestimated the size and scope of the Russian countryside. European Russia, over 1 million square miles, about the same amount of space between miles between the Mississippi River and the eastern seaboard. France, by comparison, 50,000 square miles, about the size of New York State. So the distances were vast, and the roads were mostly dirt. And when it rained, they would become a muddy quagmire. And even, trucks with wheels would bog down, but even tanks on treads would get bogged down. So they're attacking, they're winning, they're beating the Russians. But the weather suddenly turned and made the roads difficult. And they were running into trouble in the southern pronged attack. So Hitler ordered the Moscow center group to stop and hold their place. And he took forces, assets from them, and put them down in the south to help their fight. Moscow should have been the #1 priority target. It's the capital. It's, as Mark mentioned, the hub for trains and communication. It was the center of a centralized government. It should have been #1. But they held that force in place for a couple of months. This gave the Russians time to build up their defenses. By the time the forces were brought back to the center group and they could continue, well, they got to the suburbs, but they couldn't get into Moscow itself. The Russians were strong enough to drive them out. The northern group was going toward Leningrad. Why? It was symbolic. Lenin was the man who gave the world the Communist Party, and Leningrad named after him, so it was the symbol. It used to be St. Petersburg in the old days, and now it is St. Petersburg again today. But instead of attacking and taking the city, Hitler ordered the northern group to surround and lay siege to the city. I don't know why. I have no idea why he did that, unless it was just some sort of hateful thing on his part. It didn't make sense. That siege lasted for 2.5 years. That's 2.5 years that German force was stuck at Leningrad, where they could have been used elsewhere where the real fighting was. And all it did was, 1 million or so Russian soldiers and civilians starving. It was, almost medieval in the siege. Starving and the freezing weather in the winter. It was terrible. But like I said, you're wasting valuable assets sitting, surrounding the city, but not attacking and trying to capture it. Just holding it in place. Didn't make sense. Well, overall, his whole aspect of the Russian invasion wasn't working. At first they were, but the Russians, they don't give up so easy. As a matter of fact, since the factories that produced the war material were in danger of being destroyed or overrun, they dismantled everything and they moved it on the other side of the Ural Mountains in Siberia, set up the factories and started producing the weapons they needed. And one of those was the T-34 tank. Some consider that the very best tank that came out of World War II. Fast, heavy armored, high velocity 76 millimeter gun, which was later upgunned to an even heavier 80 millimeter gun. It became the killer tank that the Russians had and was the only tank that could match the Tiger tank and the King Tiger tanks that the Germans had. And they just produced them and rolling on. And Siberian troops were brought in, and let me tell you, you want to talk about some really tough people, and I mean, tough. The Siberian troops, they used them in groups called tank riders. Now, you've all probably seen pictures of soldiers riding on tanks across country. And when they come to where the enemy is, they dismount and fight on foot. Well, tank riders didn't dismount. There's the German defensive line. The tanks are moving straight in, and the guys are still riding the tanks until they are right on top of the Germans. Then they jump off and engage in combat. Needless to say, the casualties among tank riders was pretty high. Because as they're approaching, the Germans are shooting everything they have at them, and those guys they're exposed. They're not behind armor. But that's what they did. They were that tough, that brutal. And the Germans couldn't believe it. Germans hated the Russians. It was a brutal war because they hated each other. No mercy given. Well, the Russians were able to, of course, surround Stalingrad, where the Germans were, and they couldn't get out. General Paulus was the German commander, but they were surrounded by close to 1.5 million Russian soldiers. They were running out of supplies. It was winter again, very bad, cold winter. They needed planes to bring in supplies, so many tons per day. Well, Hermann Göring said, we can do it. We'll do it. We'll get them everything they need. But in truth, he got them maybe a small percentage of what they would need to keep going. And as the Russians expanded, they captured some of the airfields that the Germans were using to land their supply transports. So it became less and less. Well, Hitler knew that Paulus was getting weak, but he refused to let him pull out or surrender. So he made him a field marshal, thinking that that would inspire him to hang on and fight until the last man. And Paulus said, I don't think so. So he surrendered, and that was the turning point in the entire Russian campaign, fall of Stalingrad. It was only a matter of time. The Russians kept pushing the Germans back into Germany and into the Balkan countries, which, by the way, I don't know if most people are aware of this, but a number of the Balkan countries were also members of the Axis powers. Romania, Bulgaria, they joined the Axis. Albania, they were fighting. Mostly they were fighting against the Russians, traditional rivalry and all that. But they were also part of the Axis. So when the Russians came in to liberate, they actually just took it and kept it for themselves. That's why you have the Iron Curtain in the countries behind the Iron Curtain. And they pushed into Germany, and they, of course, captured Berlin, which effectively brought the war to an end. But mistakes that Hitler made, at the time, they may not have figured out that this was going to come back around, the ramifications, but it weakened them. It weakened them to the point where they didn't have enough of the military assets to reinforce their movement into Russia. All of those soldiers that were lost in the North Africa campaign, in Italy, in France, in Normandy, they couldn't beat with a second front, Germany fighting a two-front war. They couldn't reinforce the people in Russia that desperately needed reinforcement. So these mistakes that Hitler made helped us win the war. And that's why he was the best secret weapon that we had. Any questions? Any questions at all?
What questions are there? I'll walk around the mic. We got one over here.
Jeff Lynn, if you had to guess of which the mistakes were made, which one would you think was the worst mistake that you made?
That's a good question because I think the turning point for Germany was the invasion of Russia that didn't quite work the way they thought it would. So I'm thinking his delay and starting out in the summer, which is too late in the year. If he had been more patient and waited, he could have waited till the spring of next year, giving him time to build up even stronger. So I would say that, of all the mistakes he made, that was the one that wound up nailing the final nails in the coffin for the Third Reich.
What other questions? I saw some. Mike, can you hear me okay? My name is Tom King. I just finished a book. I'm a history buff myself. The book was about Rommel and Montgomery and Patton.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I've sent it to a fellow veteran in Minnesota who we kept in contact for 50 years since Fort Knox in 71.
Okay.
Anyway, long story short, there is a line in this book that says Rommel made a statement to his second in command when he saw a Sherman tank that he felt from that point forward the war was going to be over for the Germans.
Mm.
This was early on before they tried to tag him for the threat against Hitler when they tried to get Hitler at one of the meetings or whatever. Anyway, a staff meeting or whatever. But it came down, he recognized that it was going to be a war of attrition.
Yes.
And he didn't have the Panzer tanks to fight all the Allies. It's an interesting book.
That is summed up very nicely, actually, because we outproduced everybody. When the United States got the industrial might going, we were producing so many things, weapons, Sherman tanks. We were able to give Sherman tanks to the British, we gave them to the Free French, we gave them to the Chinese nationals. I mean, Sherman tanks became the most common Allied tank around the world. And like you say, when we saw the Sherman, it was a good tank. It was good up until the Germans came up with your Tiger and the King Tiger and the Panther. Those were tanks that had heavier guns and enough armor to withstand the 75 millimeter shot from the Sherman. But their earlier tanks would have been easy meat for the Sherman. Now, eventually, they upgunned the Shermans to 76 millimeter. That's a high velocity gun. that will penetrate the armor much better than the 75. But we produced them. So one Tiger tank could knock off 4 or 5 Shermans in a battle. But we just had more Shermans and kept coming. So production of German tanks was never able to meet the demand, never. And Rommel knew that. And he says, you know, when I lose tanks, I can't replace them like they can. And that's what happened.
Any question? Yeah, it's Bill Hope.
Yes.
Hey, Ted. Got a question. You made the statement that had they taken Moscow,
Yeah.
then, because let me preface that by saying Germany did not have resources of their own as far as fuel.
Yes.
They have no oil.
Yes.
Nothing like that.
Right.
So, them not taking Moscow and being stupid enough, as you mentioned, to not go down to the Middle East and get oil,
Yeah.
that was one of the worst thing he did.
Well, that was part of the Russian thing, the Russian attack, like I was telling you, Tony. But yeah, like I said, he could have listened. Well, even Keitel, one of his generals, said it was more important to capture Cairo in Egypt than it was to capture London, because that's where they would go through. Yeah, that was a big mistake. You can argue, debate which one was the worst aspect, but they were all involved, because the whole reason he didn't do the Middle East thing is he was focused on Russia. That's all he wanted to do. I'm gonna get Russia. You know. So yeah, he and moving the troops out of the center group, going for Moscow, was a big mistake. Got a couple of people over here. Oh, go ahead.
I'm Rhonda. My question is, did Germany ever retain any of the land that they stole during World War II?
No. Pretty much everything they had captured was, back to the original owners. So I don't think, as a matter of fact, now at the end of the war, half of Germany became under communist Russian rule, and half of Berlin, the city, was the same. So not only did they not retain, but they basically lost territory. But no, they didn't get to keep anything that they conquered, which is only right.
My name's James Woods. I read an appraisal a long time ago by a German officer about the North African campaign, and he was concerned that if they committed very many forces to North Africa, that they could not support them, because Tripoli and I think it was Benghazi, neither one of them were particularly well developed, and they were already near maximum capacity just to support the Italians, and really didn't have a lot of spare capacity to support a very large German force.
That is true. When Hitler finally gave this young officer named Rommel, who had proved himself in Poland and France as a good tank commander, gave him 2 units to take to North Africa. But it took them months to get all of that down there. And it was precisely for the reason you mentioned. The port cities were limited, and it just was impossible to get them all there in time, fast enough. So he had to wait until he had most of his assets before he could launch his attacks. Once he did, he was doing pretty good for the most part, until he got to El Alamein. But yeah, you're right, the ports were not very well developed, and it was hard to get the supplies to them. And one of the reasons is the British held on to Malta, the island near Italy. It became a sally port for British forces to interdict German and Italian convoys trying to take supplies to the North Africa. They put siege, they laid siege, they bombed and all of that. Malta held on, very valiant people, so they were able to maintain that base of operations. And that, like I said, they interfered with the supply convoys. So all of those together made it very difficult, if not downright impossible, to keep the German forces in North Africa supplied to the level they needed to be.
We are going to continue our Q&A portion, but Tim Bray, if you'd raise your hand. He's going to be passing around the sailor cap, help support our programs here, Lunch, Learn, and Shares. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Dean.
Hi.
From what I've read, one of the best field generals that ever lived was Erwin Rommel. And he had taken all of North Africa up to El Alamein. They could not get him supplies and he had to surrender.
Yeah.
Another major mistake was they got him back to Germany. He was smart enough to put him in charge of the D-Day beaches of where we would be invading. If Hitler would have listened to what Erwin Rommel told him to do and not do, we would have been thrown off those beaches in Normandy. We would have never put 20 foot of beach on us. And he completely went against everything that this man told him to do. Thank God he was that stupid. We lost 6,000 guys in one day.
Yeah. Rommel probably has the reputation of being the best German general during the war. I mean, there are other generals who knew their business, but Rommel's the most famous, and he was a very brilliant man. And you're right, the beaches, Hitler did not listen to his men. He would listen, and then he would ignore it. Yeah. Yeah, right. Right.
Brian Brenholm. Back then, you had a European gauge on the rails, and the Russians had a different size gauge on their rails. How much difference do you think it made in them properly being able to supply their troops? Because I know they were counting on capturing those rail lines and using them for supply trains.
Like you say, they did have a different gauge, so German trains could only go so far, and then they would have to switch to a Russian-type train to go beyond that. And both the Russian and the Germans, after the invasion, had armored trains patrolling the tracks. I mean, big guns, machine guns, thicker armor, and they were, patrolling to keep the partisans, the Russian partisans away. You see, another mistake the Germans made, Hitler made. They went into the Ukraine. Now, I know, and maybe some of you realize, Ukrainians are not Russian. They're part of Russia at that time, but they are not Russian. And the Ukrainians hated the Stalin regime. They saw the Germans as liberators. They welcomed them. Hey, come on, have some bread. But the Germans considered all Slavs subhuman, not worthy of mercy or respect. And Hitler signed an order called the Commissar Directive, where basically he told, it's okay to shoot any of these guys if they look at your cross-eyed. You don't have to worry about, the niceties of war. So the brutal treatment of these people, they got to see the truth. They said, well, now wait a minute. Okay, if that's the case, they formed partisan groups, and I mean the Russian partisans were a tough bunch. And they harassed and killed and sabotaged, and the whole time the Germans were fighting the Russian army in the front. In the rear, they were being hit by the partisans. And that just made it harder for them to get their conquering done. So, yeah, but the trains, that was a problem. So they had to go, the trains from Germany would cross the border, but once they reached a certain point, they wouldn't fit on the railroads. Another complication.
Mark Fehrenbacher. There's two other ideas of Hitler's blunders I'd like you to comment on. The first one is after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. declared war on Japan, but not Germany.
That's right.
It was like the 11th that Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S.
Yes.
And if Hitler hadn't declared war, the U.S. would have stayed out of Europe because there was a strong sentiment against the war in Europe. And then the second point I'd like you to comment on, the ME-262, the German jet fighter. If Hitler hadn't interfered with that production, because he insisted on jet bombers to hit England, that there was still a chance for Germany to still regain air power in Europe, but he insisted on bombers instead of fighters. So if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Two correct points, sir. Very good, because, the jet fighter could have stopped the daylight bombing and the night bombing because it was equipped with radar, I believe, that would have made it easier to find the planes at night. And they could have really devastated the Allies' bombing force. You're right. Hitler said, "Oh, I want bombers. I want bombers to go over and drop more bombs on London." That was a bad decision. And your other point was also well taken. So, like I said, it was Hitler that helped us win the war. Thank you. Well, thank you. We do have 2 more questions. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Ted, 2 more questions. Ted,
Oh, yeah.
you get a bonus.
Yeah.
Ken Hill. I listened to a historian who's pretty knowledgeable, is Victor Hansen, and he said that there was one reason Germany did not win the war, and if they had done it, they would have won the war, is that they never developed a 4-engine bomber.
They were European egocentric in their view, and all of their bombers except one were 2-engine bombers, what we would call light or medium bombers. The range wasn't that great. It was just enough to get from France over England. The only 4-engine plane they had was the Focke-Wulf Condor. Beautiful plane, big plane, 4 engines. But you know what they used it for? Because of its longer range, it went out over the Atlantic to hunt for the convoys coming in from Canada and the United States. And then it would radio that position to U-boats or surface raiders, whichever was out there, to intercept. They didn't really use it so much as a bomber. They could have, but they didn't. And again, I don't know why they didn't think of that. But they were, all of their bombers, the Heinkels, the Dorniers, the Junkers, all of them, were 2-engine bombers. That seemed to be their favorite style. And as a result, they didn't have the range they could have used. Just, again, short-sightedness.
All right, we have one more question.
And before that question, the atom bomb, which was a big difference in the war over Japan, what is your hypothesis if Hitler would have developed that and he had a lot of the science to do that, and what happened to that science, as well as the long-range bombers? They had that on the drawing board. They could have gone all the way to the United States and come back. They had those 2 things. What happened to the development of those 2?
Everybody knows Germany was working on the atomic bomb, and I'm not a physicist, so I can't give you the scientific analysis, but apparently they went down the wrong hall there and wound up not coming up with what they needed to get a working bomb. like I said, like it's been explained to me by somebody who knows atomic energy and all of that. They made a mistake in that. Here's something a lot of people don't know. Japan was also working on an atomic bomb. Matter of fact, the Army and the Japanese Navy both had individual programs. They both had the people who knew what to do. They had limited, as far as uranium and all of that, they had limited resources in that regard. But they had, in Korea, which was a Japanese protectorate for many years, they had their research center. There is a story by a U.S. journalist that says, and there's no way to prove it, that they actually test fired an atomic bomb in North Korea. Japan had a target list. Japan had, the idea to put a bomb on a submarine, sail into New York Harbor or San Francisco Harbor or whatever, and which, of course, the submarine would be like a suicide submarine, right? They also thought that, when the fleet of American invasion force approached Japan, they would take a submarine and get under the fleet and explode. So they had targets already listed for when they had the working bomb. How close they came is still unknown, except by a few people on the inside, maybe. But they apparently were much closer than the Germans. They would have used it, and if the Germans got it, they would have used it. There is no doubt, no doubt. So, thank God, the raid on the Norwegian heavy water factory that slowed down the process there by partisans and OSS and all of that, that interfered with their program. But like I said, apparently the Germans tried one way that didn't work, and that put them behind. Japan came close. There's a theory, and I'll go just a little longer here. When we dropped our first bomb, the theory is they sent their physicists out there to check out and determine what kind of bomb was it. Oh, uranium-235. Well, that takes forever to enrich uranium to get it to that point. So don't surrender. We still have time to get our bomb and get it back. But when the second bomb was dropped, and they ran down there and checked it out, and they said, oh, plutonium. They can make those like that. They could stand off and never even invade the islands and just drop those. Game over, folks. We might as well give in. There's no way to beat that. That's a theory that this one man wrote a book about, and I think there may be some truth to that. So Japan came closer than the Germans did, but you can bet either one of them, if they had gotten to that point, they would have used them, definitely would have used them, no doubt.
John Brown, when we was on minesweepers in the Med, I took a week of basket leave and went to Malta because I had read about Malta. And Malta was the most heavily bombed island in World War II. And those people had caves that they would go into, and it was read about it. They suffered great, but they never gave in.
True, very true.
Thank you.
By the way, how many veterans of war do we have here with us today? Okay.
Force.
Gentlemen
Thank you.
and ladies out there, thank you very much.
Here's one more.
Truly the greatest generation, and I honor you all.
I would like to for you to comment. Do you have any comment about Hitler not dying in Germany and going to Argentina and other scientists and everything? And let me just also say, I read a book about a nuclear physicist in Germany who deliberately sabotaged his own experiments to prevent Germany from having an atomic bomb.
Right. I know of it. I can't give you the details on that, but I've certainly heard about that. You know, brave man. As far as the other things, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that, to be honest. I usually have an opinion about everything. That one, I'm not sure. What is your viewpoint on that, if I may ask? Okay. Well, like I say, I just don't know how to answer that question, and I apologize for that. I'll think on that. I'll have to do some more research. I'll get back to it.
This will be the last question.
And this is quick, this is more of an add-on to your last question. You might find the answer if you catch the story how Einstein had friends in Germany, and that's how he knew they were developing the bomb. And then he went to Roosevelt and said, "We got to do this."
Yeah.
And if you study that story, you might find the answer that you were asking. Because I know a little bit about it, but I haven't went any in depth on it, so it might be worth looking into. Thank you.
Let's give it up for Ted Zucker.